To see everyone this evening. We've been kind of in Genesis roaming around, and I kind of want to stay. I'm in the wrong one now. Should be Samuel. I loaded it. It should be there. Drive. Wednesday night. Anyway, so I want to kind of stay in the Old Testament for a little while, just because I don't think we spend enough time there, and there's just so much we can learn. I think the Old Testament gives us these images, pictures of God that we don't get in the New Testament. And I am not saying we shouldn't study the New Testament. We do all the time, but if you really look at the Old Testament and a lot of how God deals with man and in the way that God reckons man is really fascinating to me, and I always get a lot out of it when I study that. And I kind of wanted to go to 1 Samuel to start with, because Samuel is a book of the Bible that we go to it a lot, don't we? In vacation Bible schools, Bible classes, we use that a lot. There's so many stories out of there, isn't there? Bible stories, if you think about it. David and Goliath comes out of there, right? And, the shepherd, David the shepherd, right? And that story comes out of there. And we get the sin with, not necessarily in 1 Samuel, but we get such a picture of Israel coming together as a united nation. It's the only time in the Bible that this really happens. It's a time when Israel has the land. They have what God told them they were going to have. And underneath the leadership, especially of David, they become a nation. And they become the greatest they will ever be under Solomon, which happens right after 2 Samuel. So it's really an interesting time in the history of Israel. And Israel at this time is God's people. And God never wanted them to have a king. God never desired it. We're the kingdom, right? We're the kingdom of God. We should understand that the church is the kingdom, and we're the kingdom. And God doesn't want us to have a leader on earth. God never intended for us to do that. God doesn't want us to do that. And God never wanted them to have a king. God wanted it to be a theocracy. God wanted to be their king. And God wanted them to do what he said to do. And God sent judges, didn't he? Because why? They didn't do what God said to do. So nations came in and attacked them, and we had the book of Judges. And so all these judges were raised up, Samson and Deborah and all these different judges were raised up, Gideon, and they were brought up to protect, to fend off the enemies of Israel. And then it leads us into Samuel, into this time in the history of Israel. This is a time when there's no temple in this book. Temple's not going to be built till Solomon, so there's no temple. It's still just a tent in the wilderness. It's still just a tabernacle. And it's not in Jerusalem. Now, it's not there. It's not in Jerusalem. And so it's a unique time. And the book of Samuel starts with a guy by the name of Elkanah. And Elkanah was one of those guys in the Bible that we don't think a lot about him. But the interesting thing about him is that he's one of the guys that God picked. God always finds people, doesn't he? People that are special, people that stand out, people that are godly, people that he uses. And we don't think about Elkanah much, but he's a guy who really has a key role in this. This is Samuel's dad, right? This is Samuel's dad. And Samuel's going to be a priest and a judge. Samuel's going to have this dual role. And he's one of the only people in the Bible that really has that. He's going to be a judge. He's going to be a priest. He's going to be a seer, as they call it. He's a prophet, right? God's going to speak to him directly. But he had a history. And his history starts with Elkanah. It starts with his family. Elkanah and his wives. Elkanah had 2 wives in the Bible. This is the time when that was fine. There was no law against that. It was not against God to have multiple wives. And Elkanah did, right? He had 2 wives. And in these wives, one of them, as often happens in the Bible, one was barren. Hannah was barren, right? And Peninnah, she had children, but Hannah had no children. And he would go, and see, this is where we start to see this. He would go to worship and sacrifice to the Lord at Shiloh. That's where the tabernacle is now. The temple, there's no Jerusalem, there's no temple. There's just this tent that they carried through the wilderness, this building that they carried through the wilderness, this tent, and it's in Shiloh. And so the priest, who is Eli now, the priest, he's just serving in this tent in Shiloh because there's no temple. Like I said, Jerusalem doesn't matter yet. David hasn't made Jerusalem his own. This is before all that happens. God's still dwelling in a tent. And so they go to this place, and when they go there, Eli's sons, right, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord there. And they came that Elkanah sacrificed. He would give portions to Peninnah's wife and to all her sons and her daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. Now, we don't really know who wrote 1 Samuel. We don't really know who did that. And it's one of those interesting, in the Old Testament, if you study the Old Testament, it's just like the book of Daniel. You know, and I'd love to do Daniel. We'll do Daniel one of these days. But in the book of Daniel, it's kind of interesting because if you read through the book of Daniel, it's first, second, and third person, which is kind of interesting, right? And in this book, this isn't Samuel writing this, even though it's called 1 Samuel. It's about Samuel, right? But it's not Samuel. Samuel didn't write it. We don't really know who wrote it. This is a third-person account. More of, maybe you would say, a historical text. But in this text, in the story of Samuel, the beginning is here. The idea, as in the case of Sarai, who was barren until God gave her a child, till God gave her, and we talked about that in Genesis, right? This is another case of a barren woman. We're going to see the same thing happen with Elizabeth and Zechariah and the birth of John the Baptist. She was barren. She was a barren woman, unable to have children, and God opened her womb, right? We see this in the case of Rachel with Jacob, right? Rachel was barren. Leah had all the children. Rachel was barren, and eventually God opened the womb of Rachel, and she had Joseph, right, and Benjamin. So it's not unusual. And in the Old Testament, the womb being closed is always a God thing. Have you ever noticed that? It's never like we would think, right? Our cause is way different than that, right? We would say, oh, well, it's a medical issue. Maybe it is, right? It's some reason she can't conceive. Something's wrong with her. And then in our world today, we wouldn't look at a barren woman. I don't think any of us would look at a woman who couldn't have children and say God closed her womb. Do you think we would say that today? I don't think we would say that, would we? We wouldn't say, well, God just closed her womb, right? We would say, well, there's a problem, right? She has endometriosis, or she has some kind of an issue and she can't conceive. But in the Old Testament especially, it was real cause and effect. And children were a blessing from God. Children are a blessing from God. That's never changed. Children are a blessing from God. And in the Old Testament, to not have children was a curse. And women were really looked down upon because they couldn't bear. If you remember the story of Rachel and Leah, remember that? Leah had children. Rachel was so upset that she had her handmaid deliver a child on her lap so that she could call it hers. Remember that story? Because she was looked down upon because she was unable to bear, unable to have children. Look at the story of Sarah, right, and Abraham. Sarah gave Hagar into Abraham because she basically couldn't conceive, right? And so she wanted to have children basically through her handmaid. And you see that also in the case of Jacob. So it was a really big thing not to have children, and it was a really big thing not to have male children, right? Because male children were where the inheritance came from, right? Male children was your lineage, You couldn't leave to a daughter. If you only had daughters, your lineage, your next male relative would be your inheritance. You couldn't leave it in the Old Testament, under the law, you couldn't leave it to your daughter. It would go to the next male inheritance. So it was really a big thing, not only to have children, but to have male children was a really, really big thing. So here's poor Hannah. Hannah can't have children. Hannah's unable to bear. The Bible says the Lord had closed her womb. But Hannah, and I think this is where you see this faith with Hannah. He loved her, right? The Bible says that he gave her a double portion. And in the Bible, that's a really big thing because if you remember in Kings, the end of 1 Kings, the story of Elijah and Elisha, or the beginning of 2 Kings, if you remember that story, Elijah's going to get taken up by the Lord, right? And Elijah leaves in a chariot of fire. Remember that story? Elijah is one of only 2 people in the Bible that was transcended, basically never died. So Elijah's carried off. And if you remember the story, Elijah has called Elisha, and Elisha's following Elijah. And Elijah says, basically stay here. I'm going to go. This is going to happen. And Elisha said, no, I want to go with you. I want to see this happen. And Elijah told Elisha, he said, if you'll see me be carried up, then you'll get a double portion. That's why we call Elisha the prophet of the double portion. Because he said, if you see me carried up, you'll get a double portion. So Elijah was carried off in a chariot of fire. Elijah dropped his mantle that went around him, and Elisha picked up the mantle, and God gave Elijah a double portion. Now, if you also remember in Genesis, remember Joseph, and remember last week, right at the end of Genesis, and we were talking about Jacob blessing the children of Joseph that he had while he was in Egypt, and he said, Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, right? Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine. And so he said, I'm going to give you a double inheritance, double blessing. So Joseph got a double blessing because his inheritance went to Ephraim and Manasseh. He got a double blessing. So a double blessing is a big thing in the Bible. So basically, what's going on here is that Elkanah is going to worship. He's going to sacrifice, and he's giving all of his family, which is not unusual in the Old Testament, he's supplying his family their sacrifice. Now, if you remember the book of Job, remember where it said that Job sacrificed for his children, right? Job sacrificed for his children. So he would give them. So it gives you an idea of the wealth of Elkanah, right? He was able to supply. He had 2 wives, which was a big thing. And he was able to supply them. And he was able to give his wives and children what they needed to sacrifice, which was a big thing. Supply that. But he gave Hannah a double portion. But Hannah, her rival, of course, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. And it happened year after year, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Then Hannah rose after. What is he saying? He says, I love you more than my other wife. You're my favorite, right? For whatever reason. That I guess happens. Obviously Rachel was Jacob's favorite. Leah had sad eyes. I still don't know what that means, but Leah had sad eyes, right? So obviously he loved her, and he wanted to provide. Aren't I better than you than 10 sons? Don't I provide for you? Don't I take care of you? Right? But she's in Shiloh, right? And Eli was there. And Eli's the priest. And she prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. Hannah went to make her sacrifice. This has happened year after year. And you wonder, and I would think, that every year Hannah was praying fervently for a child, right? Every year Hannah was probably praying. to give her a child, to open the womb. Because like I said, they really thought that was a God thing. And when you couldn't bear, it was because somehow you were cursed. You had done something wrong. You had somehow angered God, and God had closed your womb. And so she was making this sacrifice, praying fervently, to the Lord to give her a child, to open her womb. And God, I'm not moving, Shannon. And so God, He is going to answer this, right? And so she makes a bargain here. Now that's really common. Have you ever bargained with God? Have you ever bargained? Have you ever made a prayer and bargained? You can be honest. Right? Have you ever made a bargain? Have you ever prayed to God and said, God, if you'll do this, I will, right? David says, never bargain with God. Do you think it's okay to bargain with God? I mean, that's what a vow is, basically, right? A vow says, promises God you'll do something, right? Promise Him you'll. Well, it's interesting because she makes this vow, and this isn't, and if you look at it, it's a vow. You see that? You see that? She made a vow. And vows in the Old Testament are unbreakable. You can't break a vow. So this is a big thing. Because this vow she made, it basically says that I'm going to make him a Nazirite. Okay? I'm going to give him to you all the days of his life. But it was more than that. Look at what she put. Look at what she says. She says, I'm going to, number one, she says it has to be a son. You see that? She didn't just say, give me a child, did she? She said, if you'll give me a son, she says, I will what? She says, I will give him to you. I've always pondered that. God came to Manoah, Samson's parents. He said, I'm going to give you a child, and you're not to do anything to do with the grape, nothing to do with the grape, nothing that. Going to make you a Nazirite, right? Never gave Samson a choice, did he? God never asked Samson, did he? Because Samson wasn't even born. He basically just said, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to go on. What about John the Baptist? Right? John the Baptist is one guy in the Bible that didn't get opt-in. Did he? He was set. This is what you're going to do. This is who you're going to be. I've always thought with Samson that he didn't want to do that. That's always my take on Samson. Samson didn't like it. Samson was stuck with it. Have you ever really got that when you look at Samson? Samson didn't really embrace his destiny, did he? He kind of ran from his destiny. He kind of did everything against his destiny. He kind of did everything against God. He never embraced it, did he? Never really embraced what he could have done, who he could have been. Samson was, I guess I shouldn't say this because I know we really built Samson up to our little kids, but Samson was a disappointment. To me, if you really read the story, yeah. Right. I think what you see is that God used, Samson's disobedience for God's glory, even though Samson wasn't really. But the other thing you got to remember, too, and I think we forget this sometimes, somebody was telling Samson's story, right? And they wanted him to look as favorable as they could make him look. I know, but I'm just saying, they tried to help him out. You know what I'm saying? Because they're telling that story. And Samson's God's guy, right? Whether or not Samson wanted to be God's guy was irrelevant. Samson was God's guy. And God was going to use him one way or another, you see. But Samuel's different. Because Samuel embraced, even though Samuel didn't have a say, Samuel didn't have a chance to decide this. His mother decided it. But he embraced it. He became this guy. He became exactly the man that his mother vowed that he would be. And I've always found that fascinating in the Bible. He embraced what, I guess you could say, his destiny. Maybe that's a bad word. But he embraced himself. He embraced what was set before him. Because this vow is big. It's not only saying, I'm going to give him to you, I'm going to leave him with you, and I'm going to make him a Nazirite. Now, it came about as she continued praying that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, only her lips were moving, her voice was not heard, so Eli thought she was drunk. Kind of sounds like Acts chapter 2 with the apostles, doesn't it? They said, why are these men drunk? And when Eli said to her, how long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But Hannah replied, no, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, and I have poured out my soul before the Lord, she says. You know, she was distressed. So what about the Nazirite thing? When you think about Nazirites in the Bible, who do you think of, right? There are 3 men in the Bible. Samuel. There were 3 men in the Bible that were Nazirites from birth, their whole life. Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. They were Nazirites from birth. A Nazirite is in Numbers chapter 6. Chapter 6. And a Nazirite could be a man or a woman. I know of no examples of a woman Nazirite in the Bible. And I wonder how that would have played out, because you had to shave your head at the end of it. So I kind of wondered how that would have played out if it had been a woman. But Nazirites generally vowed for 30 or 60 or 90 days, like a month or 3 months. And Nazirites at the time of Christ, they tended to stay in the temple. They didn't go outside of the temple. And when you were done with a Nazirite, you had to make a sacrifice. What is the purpose of a Nazirite vow, do you think? Why did people do that? You know, Paul in Acts, remember the story where Paul's gone and he says he cut his hair because of a vow, right? He cut his hair because of a vow. That was a Nazirite vow. So Paul is a Christian. This is after Paul's conversion, and Paul makes a Nazirite vow to God. How's it different? Right. These guys were lifelong, and generally Nazirite vows weren't. When Paul comes back to Jerusalem, remember that? Well, maybe. Vows have a reason. Why do you vow? Why did people vow to God? What was the purpose of a vow? Number one, why did you do it? Why would you make a vow? Huh? To be holy? Maybe so you'd have a reason not to do the other stuff? Right. Well, the one reason they stayed in the temple was because if you touched a dead body or anything to do with a grape, you had to start over. So they thought it was safer to stay in the temple because chances are you wouldn't break your vow. Because if you broke your vow, you had to start again. That's how it worked. So if you did anything to do with a grape or you touched a dead body, you had to start over. So, yeah. But a lot of times in the Bible, why do people make vows? Why do they do it? Yeah, right there, to get something. They want something, right? I mean, isn't that why they make vows? Absolutely. I vow the first thing that comes out of my daughter's house if you'll give me this battle. And guess what? The first thing that walked out of his daughter's, or the first thing that walked out of his house was his daughter, right? And he couldn't break a vow. Can't break a vow, right? Vows were because you wanted something. Why did Hannah make this vow? Wanted a child. It's better to have a child and give him to God than not have a child. Am I right? Because isn't that what she's thinking? So she wants the child. She's going to make a vow. So she makes this vow. And on a Nazirite vow, he shall abstain from wine. Now, it's kind of interesting in this that it doesn't say to abstain from women. That would have really helped Samson if we could have done that, right? But that's not part of a Nazirite vow. Abstaining from women is not part of a Nazirite. Can't have a grape, but you can have a bunch of wives, right? I don't understand it. It's just how it is, right? But he says wine, nothing to do with the grape. You can't have anything to do with the skin, the stem, the wine, vinegar, nothing to do with the grape. Why do you think that was a big thing in that world? Why not have anything to do with the grape? To me and you, now that doesn't seem like a big thing. I'll just drink Diet Pepsi. But right? Yeah, it's everywhere. I mean, grapes were fermented to make wine, not probably the wine like we know as wine, but they fermented it to store it, grape juice. I mean, you didn't have a lot of things. I mean, you didn't have a lot to drink. You either drank water or something to do with fruit, right? And grapes were kind of the big fruit to drink. I mean, that's kind of how it was. So you kind of had two things, right? You was either going to drink water or you was going to drink probably something to do with the grape. So it was a big deal to say, and water wasn't that great. So, right? Matter of fact, remember what Paul told Timothy? He says, take a little wine, right, for your stomach, because apparently Timothy didn't, and water wasn't really that great, right? Water was pretty contaminated. So it was a really big thing. And then the other thing is you can't cut your hair. You can't cut your hair. All the days of separation he shall not eat anything that is produced by the grapevine, from the seeds even to the skin. All the days of his vow of separation, no razor shall pass over his head. He shall be holy until the days are fulfilled for which he separated himself to the Lord. He shall let the locks of hair on his head grow long. And at the end of a vow, if you were in the temple, you shaved your head, you made a sacrifice. If you weren't in the temple, you cut your hair, not shave it. That's what Paul did. You cut your hair, you carry it with you till you go back to the temple. That's what happened in Acts. Paul goes back to the temple till you go back to the temple, and then you burn your hair on the altar. You make your sacrifice. That ends your vow. So that was a Nazirite vow. So Samson is never going to cut his hair, or not Samson. Samuel is never going to cut his hair his whole life, ever, not once. I grow lots of hair, so I hate to guess how that would work out for me, but it wouldn't be good. So anyway, so she pours out her soul. Don't consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now to my great concern and provocation. Then Eli answered and said, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. She said, let your maidservant find favor in his sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. And they arose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord and returned again to their house to Ramah. And Elkanah had relation with Hannah's wife, and the Lord remembered her. You see, whoever writes this, the way this works out, it's God. God's all in this, right? God closed her womb, and God opened her womb. You see that? The Lord remembered her, and the Lord opened her womb, right? And it said, it came about after Hannah had conceived that she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. But now she has this vow, right? Now she has this vow to fulfill. It would be hard. I can't imagine taking my child somewhere and leaving them. Now, Hannah wouldn't go back to the temple until the child was weaned. And in that society, that could be 3 to 5 years old. It's a little different than it is with us. Could be 3 to 5 years old in that society. Matter of fact, we kind of know that with Moses, you know. Moses knew he was Hebrew. Moses knew his mother. Because chances are, by the time that she actually gave him to Pharaoh's house, he could have been as old as 5 before she gave him up totally back to the house of Pharaoh. So she had him, but when she weaned him, she goes to the temple, right? And it says here, she took him with her with a 3-year-old bull and an ephah of flour and a jug of wine and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. Although the child was young, they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. Shannon brought the bull to Eli. And she said, "Oh, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you, praying to the Lord. For this boy I prayed. The Lord has given me my petition, which I ask of him, so I dedicate him to the Lord as long as he lives." He is dedicated to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. So Hannah brings him back to the temple, 3 to 5 years old, and she leaves him there. That's kind of almost hard to imagine, isn't it? She leaves him at the temple for Eli to raise. So it's interesting, the start of this story. It's a story. And this is a story. This is a story, and it's just, whoever wrote Samuel, they wanted us to see it, the whole story, the background of the story, what was going on, what they thought, what they felt, what they were going through. And she leaves him at the temple. And every time I read this part of Samuel, I just picture in my mind what that would be like to take my child somewhere at 5 years old even and just leave him there. And, you know, I think that would be heart-wrenching. Don't you? Especially after she prayed so hard. But she vowed. She was going to do it. She was going to do this. Give him to God, she said. Huh? Yeah, it was a miracle. And so this is such a wonderful, there's a couple places in the Bible, and this is the longest one. There's a couple places in the Bible where we get these songs of praise. It happens when the children of Israel come out of Egypt and go through the Red Sea, and they get to the other side, and Miriam sings, and it's always these women, isn't it? And you know, we talk about the Magnificat of Mary, when Mary finds out that she's going to have the baby Jesus, and she does the Magnificat, and she basically says, "My soul exalts in the Lord," right? And Hannah, this is the longest one. And Hannah, she's pouring out this text or this poem, and it is poetry. Even though in our language you don't see it because we don't do Hebrew, right? But in the Hebrew, this is poetry. This is no different than Psalms or Ecclesiastes or Job. It's poetry. And in this poetry that she pours out to God, it's just this amazing outpouring. And this, "My soul exalts in the Lord, and my horn exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation." She's talking about the other wife, right? Wasn't that her enemy, the one who oppressed her? And yet she sees this child as her salvation. You see, when you see these stories and you see this parallel between the Old Testament and the New Testament, it really kind of opens your eyes to Christ, you know? And it's the same type of thing that Mary was saying. Rejoice in your salvation, the salvation of God, right? There's no one holy like the Lord. There's no one beside you, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, and the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full hired themselves out for bread. For those who were hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren, right, gives birth to 7. But she who has many children, she has a lot more after this. God opened her womb. We'll get into that. Yeah, God blessed her beyond this, right? She gave Samuel, and God blessed her beyond that, because it's a story of faith. It's a story. We miss people like this in the Bible. We always talk about, isn't it kind of fascinating? And I do it too. I'm guilty of it. A lot of times when I'm talking about the Bible, and I talk about how women were looked down upon in the Bible and in that time, and it's true, women were oppressed and women didn't have a say. But yet, isn't it funny in the Scripture how God takes these women and exalts them, in their faith? The faith of Hannah. You don't really see it in Hannah, do you? If you read Judges and you read about Deborah, and Deborah's not a person we talk a lot about in the Bible. But Deborah didn't want to go to the battle, if you read the story. Deborah said, I'm just going to stay here. Who was the other judge? Can't remember. The judge, I can remember his name. He was the one that was supposed to go, right? He was supposed to go fight it. And he told Deborah, he says, I won't go unless you go. And so Deborah says, well, I'll go. But when we win, I'm going to get the glory, right? Because, read the story. Deborah wasn't going to jump in and do it. Deborah wasn't really the judge that was supposed to go do the job. But Deborah went because he didn't want to do it. Deborah, and we don't talk much about her, but we talk about Deborah. We talk about Ruth, right? We talk about Ruth in her strength. Remember that? Naomi, and how Ruth took care of Naomi and said, your people will be my people and your land will be my land, and I'm going to go with you and I'm going to take care of you. And she harvested wheat out of the field of Boaz, right? We talk about Rahab, who hid the spies. She's in Hebrews, right? She's in Hebrews in the household of faith. Rahab, who hid the spies because she saw the salvation that was going to come from God. We forget sometimes to talk about, and even in the Old Testament, to talk about these women who did great things. These women who were in this plan of God that did these magnificent things because of their strength and their dignity and their faith. And you see that here. You see her faith, the faith that she had. And that, to me, is just amazing. God, Jesus of all people, Jesus comes into the earth, and Jesus does more to make women equal than any other person in history. You ever thought about that? Jesus does more to make women equal than any other person in history. Women followed him, right? Women ministered to him, right? Women were at the grave. Women were at the cross. Women were at the resurrection. Who's the first person that Jesus revealed himself to after he was raised? It wasn't a man, right? It was a woman, right? It was Mary. Am I right? Jesus, that's one reason they didn't like him. When Jesus went to Bethany and stayed at the house of Mary and Martha, and Mary sat at the feet of Jesus. You and I, we don't think anything about that, do we? We just think, but in that time, for a woman, even to say Jesus was a rabbi, to teacher, for a woman to sit at the foot of a rabbi, that didn't happen. That just didn't happen. When Jesus let Mary sit at his feet, that was big. Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel. It was a big thing to sit at the feet of a teacher, sit at the feet of a rabbi. That was really an honor. And Jesus let Mary sit at his feet and listen. We forget that. Jesus really, and one reason they didn't like him. That was one of the reasons I think they really didn't like him, because he did women and he did children. Remember that? Jesus said, forbid the children to come to me not, right? For the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. And that was a society where children didn't go to a teacher, didn't go to a rabbi, especially didn't sit on his lap. That would just be unheard of, right? But yet Jesus embraced, didn't he? He embraced the poor. And everybody looked down on the poor. And remember when John the Baptist doubted Christ? Is this really the one we look for? And Jesus says, go tell John, the deaf hear, the lame walk, the blind see. But the biggest thing Jesus said was at the end, the poor have the gospel preached to them, Jesus said. You know, go tell John that I'm the Messiah because the poor had the gospel preached to them. They didn't get that. They couldn't get that. The God was reserved for the rich. God was reserved for the people with titles and the people with family and the people with lineage. And it wasn't for everybody. And Jesus got up on the Sermon on the Mount and preached to people who the gospel who'd never heard it and said, blessed are you who are poor in spirit, and blessed are you who are meek, and blessed are you who grieve. And the Pharisees in the back of the audience were looking at Jesus and saying, how would a real teacher ever teach these people? You know, Hannah, you see this faith of this woman, and a faith that carried through. I'm going to leave him here. I'm leaving him here with you. And she has this great prayer of praise, right? And Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, and the boy ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. You know, Eli had sons, right? And Eli's sons were wicked. We'll get into that. Eli's sons were terrible. But Samuel's there, and God's going to talk to Samuel. And that doesn't happen a lot. But Eli's sons are terrible. Samuel's sons are going to be terrible. It's always fascinating in the Bible how these great men of God have terrible kids. You know, I just don't get that, you know. Maybe they spend too much time with the Lord and not enough time with their kids. I don't know. I don't know what the deal is, but Eli's sons are wicked, and they're in a position of power. Eli's sons are the epitome of what's wrong when people use God for their own benefit. Whether you're talking about the Old Testament or whether you're talking today, when people use God for their own benefit, Eli's sons were in a place of honor. They were in a place of respect. They were ministering before the Lord. And Eli's sons, the writer of Samuel says, were worthless. Worthless men, the Bible says. Had no value. They did not know the Lord. They should have. I mean, Eli's the priest. They're in the temple. They ought to know God. They ought to know who God is. But it says they did not know the Lord. I always found that to be fascinating. How could they not? And look at what it is. Really interesting. Look at the word for God here. That's the name of God. That's a tetragrammaton right there. That's Yahweh, Jehovah. That's Lord. That's God's name. They did not know God. Really interesting terminology. And the reason they didn't know him, I think, is because they had lost him in the function of what was going on. You know, it's easy to lose God. You know, you think about it, these boys are raised up. These are Eli's sons. They're raised up in this tabernacle tent. They're doing these sacrifices. They watch their dad do these sacrifices. It's really about how you do it, isn't it? Doing the right sacrifice at the right time, in the right way, all these things. They got so caught up in the function that they forgot God. You know, we do that sometimes in worship. We can get so caught up in the function of worship, so caught up in doing those things that we're supposed to do, that we forget why we do it. We're just here to get our stuff done. Let's sing, let's pray, let's take communion, let's give, let's go to Outback, right? I mean, we're so caught up in the form of it that sometimes we forget why we're doing what we do. Out of time. More next week.